You could have someone who's in pension phase who's got unrestricted, non-preserved assets, and the bank then comes after them under the guarantee, and they then have to pull assets out of their fund to satisfy that guarantee.
Yep.
Even though they have a disclaimer against a right of indemnity against those assets, but
Yep.
the effect is that they've depleted those assets because they're not preserved anymore.
Yeah, correct. And that's a problem with these arrangements in general. Because it puts other assets of the super fund at risk. If the trustee's primary objective is not to default under the loan agreement, then they'll start liquidating other assets in the super fund just in order to make repayments to the bank on the leveraged asset. So they haven't addressed that issue, which is a superannuation issue. They haven't addressed that issue in the legislation. I don't think they may one day, but the position has to be, well, if you can't service, the position is a practical one, and you can't regulate all decision making by trustees. So trustees have to act on good advice to say, okay, well, if I can't meet my obligations under this loan agreement, I'm not going to liquidate assets outside super. I'm not going to liquidate other assets inside super. I'm going to let the bank come in and take possession of that leveraged asset.
Julian, can I just add something? That's one of the reasons why. That's actually one of the reasons why we don't take a member's guarantee, because around the concern of could we then have recourse to other assets because of what the legislation says. So when we take a limited guarantee, that's purely because the actual we can't take a mortgage of the property because it's a different name to the self-managed super fund. So that limited guarantee is actually a linking document between the two. But we don't take members' guarantees purely for the point that you've raised, that it does put in some question whether we could then go after other assets. So we've tried to keep it as limited recourse as possible. But that's not the view that's shared by all lenders.
Okay. One of the requirements under 67 is that the purchase of the asset is not otherwise prohibited. So I've put up these rules as a bit of a reminder for the other regulations you have to turn your mind to. The asset is purchasing the asset to put it into super and give it to the custodian is still subject to related party transaction rules. When the asset is sitting on the balance sheet, the in-house asset rules still apply. It's not that this is an asset of the custodian and not of the fund. It's still an asset of the fund, and the in-house asset rules still apply. Arm's length dealings, again, more relevant in the area of related party lending, and specifically to that issue of striking a commercial rate of interest. All dealings of the super trustees have to be struck on an arm's length or arm's length basis. And that, as I say, most relevantly applies to the interest rate. And there are the general requirements around prudence and standard of care of super trustees and making sure that they make decisions in a prudent manner. Comment quickly on trust deeds. The banks obviously really at the moment are the first port of call for bank lending. They will require your trust deed and they'll look through it. They'll be looking for three things primarily. The ability to borrow, the power of the trustees to borrow under that deed. Because the legislation was only introduced in September 2007, there'll be plenty of deeds out there that don't have sufficiently broad borrowing power, because prior to that time there were three very limited exceptions to the borrowing prohibition. The ability of the trustees to grant security over assets of the fund. At the moment, the SIS regulations prohibit trustees from granting mortgages and charges over assets of the fund. But the ATO has come out and said, well, Section 67 specifically contemplates that trustees will be providing charges or mortgages over their assets. So we're happy to regulate on that basis that Treasury's turned their mind to it. But because it's generally prohibited, there may be a general prohibition in the trust deeds, or there will at least not be specific power to grant security. Now, remember that mortgage is actually granted by the custodian and not by the super trustee, but in that instance, the custodian is really acting as the agent of the fund, so the fund can't give the custodian a power greater than the super trustee already has. Third power, obviously the ability to appoint a custodian, and that's not an unusual power. That will be in most trust deeds. But it's another one, obviously, that the bank and any lender has to check off on first. The point here is these aren't particularly remarkable amendments that need to be made to deeds. The thing is, if the deeds aren't checked well in advance and the amendment's made, then it leads to delays when you're trying to settle the purchase of the property. So what I wanted to do, just to highlight how and why compliance is so important in this context, is I've got an example on pages 6 and 7 of the extracts of a compliance issue that the fund has. And I won't read it out, but I'll go through it in summary. We have a specific purpose fund set up to purchase an asset in Melbourne. It has 2 trustees of the fund. They find a bank that's willing to lend on an LVR of 65% against that property. So we have an initial borrowing of $650,000. And the trustees contribute the balance and the costs. I've chosen the compliance problem of non-residency for a reason I'll explain in a moment. So the 2 trustees take off to Dubai to live and work for expats for a while. They're quite agreeable to it and stay over there for 3 years, creating a problem for themselves with the central management and control test, which is a requirement of a fund being a complying Australian superannuation fund. In Dubai, they get word from their accountant that the fund's been deemed to be non-complying for failing to meet the residency test. And what I've done on the following page is a brief analysis. The accountants can forgive me for how my balance sheet looks, but as a lawyer, I've done my best. Brief analysis of what the implications of that non-complying declaration are. What happens basically is in the year that a fund becomes non-complying, they have to pay top marginal rate on all current year income. Okay? The kicker, if you like, is that there is also an assessment of tax made against net previous income. And you'll see I've got a line under assessment of net previous income, assets less undeducted contributions. So that tax assessment is, we've assumed for this example, which is not unusual, that there are no undeducted contributions. So net previous income is then assessed on the value of the assets, and the valuation is a market valuation. And as you'll know, a market valuation does not take into account the presence of debt if there's any leverage on that asset. That means that when the net previous income assessment is made, no regard is had to the fact that the fund only has limited equity in the property. So in this example, current year income is assessed at $25,200 on income of $56,000.